they had reached an ocean no European had ever seen. Now they were utterly alone, adrift on the largest body of water on Earth, with no idea how far the next shore might be. How did they survive weeks without fresh food or water? What strange lands would they encounter? And how did this journey turn fatal for the man who had led them so far? In part 1, we followed Ferdinand Magellan from his early life in Portugal to his historic departure from Spain in 1519. His fleet of 5 ships braved the treacherous Atlantic, crushed a deadly mutiny, and battled the icy winds of Patagonia. At last, they found the secret passage, the Strait of Magellan, and entered the Pacific Ocean. But now, as we begin part 2, the expedition faces its greatest and most deadly test. Starvation, scurvy, and despair await them across the endless Pacific. And even when land is finally sighted, danger will be waiting. This is the second half of a journey that changed the world and ended in blood. This is the story of how Ferdinand Magellan made history. When Magellan's fleet entered the Pacific Ocean in November 1520, they believed the worst was behind them. They had survived mutiny, betrayal, and the uncharted passage through South America. But what lay ahead would prove to be the greatest ordeal of the entire voyage. Magellan named the new ocean Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea, because of its calm waters. But the name would soon feel bitterly ironic. The Pacific was not peaceful. It was merciless in its scale, and it offered no welcome. For 3 months, the fleet sailed west. They had no accurate maps, no understanding of how far Asia truly was, and they saw no land. Worse still, they had underestimated the scale of the Pacific. What they thought might take a few weeks would stretch into a deadly crossing of over 15,000 kilometers. The food stores, already damaged by the long Atlantic leg, spoiled. The drinking water grew thick and yellow. Rats became a delicacy. Leather was boiled for days just to be chewable. Scurvy tore through the crews, claiming dozens of lives. And yet, Magellan pressed on. He refused to turn back, convinced that the Spice Islands and salvation lay just beyond the horizon. In January 1521, after more than 90 days at sea, land was finally sighted. It was a small island in the present-day Marshall Islands. The men wept with relief, but the island offered little. No food, no rest, only a brief moment to regain their bearings before moving on. In March, they reached the Marianas. There, contact with the Chamorro people offered a much-needed moment of human interaction, but it was not without conflict. Tensions over supplies and misunderstandings led to violence, and Magellan responded with brutal force. The islands were labelled the Islands of Thieves in Spanish records. Still, the encounter served its purpose. The crew now had some food, water, and hope. And finally, later that same month, on the 16th of March, 1521, they saw the high green ridgelines of a new land, the islands of the Visayas. In the archipelago we now call the Philippines. The fleet anchored near the island of Homonhon. For the first time in over a year, they had reached a place rich with resources and people who would change the course of the expedition. Here, they made peaceful contact with local communities, receiving food and rest. The men were in awe of the land, the culture, and the warmth of their welcome. Magellan had no way of knowing, but this moment marked the final chapter of his personal journey. He had crossed the world, discovered a passage, and now stood on the edge of the riches he had sought from the beginning. But what happened next? His actions, his ambitions, and his alliances would determine not just the fate of the voyage, but of Magellan himself. On the 16th of March, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan and his remaining fleet made landfall in the islands now known as the Philippines. After crossing the Atlantic, the Strait of Magellan, and the uncharted Pacific, Magellan had reached what he believed to be the edge of the East Indies. But this was no final destination. These islands were politically complex, an archipelago of independent communities, rival chiefs, and regional alliances. And in the weeks that followed, Magellan would shift from explorer to power broker, inserting himself into the local politics of a place he barely understood. The first landfall was on Homonon, an uninhabited island. From there, the crew made contact with local leaders through Enrique of Malacca, Magellan's enslaved interpreter who spoke Malay, a regional trade language. Magellan met Raja Kolambu of Limasawa, who introduced him to Raja Humabon of Cebu, a significant figure in regional trade. Magellan seized the opportunity. He offered Spanish protection in exchange for political allegiance and conversion to Christianity. On the 14th of April, 1521, Raja Humabon and hundreds of locals were baptized. Crosses were raised. A political religious alliance was born. But beneath the ceremony, Magellan had made a critical assumption that Humabon's influence extended across the neighbouring islands. It didn't. The Philippines was not a unified kingdom. It was a network of decentralised barangays, independent villages or chiefdoms. One of these, the nearby island of Mactan, was ruled by Datu Lapu-Lapu, who had no intention of converting or submitting to Spanish or Cebuano authority. Magellan viewed Lapu-Lapu's resistance not as a political disagreement, but as an insult and a threat to the fragile alliance with Humabon. Determined to display Spanish military superiority, Magellan promised to bring Lapu-Lapu to heel by force. On the night of the 26th of April, Magellan prepared to attack Mactan with a small detachment of around 60 men. He declined additional native reinforcements, believing they were unnecessary. His goal was not just to defeat Lapu-Lapu, but to send a message to any other chief who might challenge Spanish authority. But the landing site was ill-suited for a swift assault. Low tide forced the Spaniards to wade across a wide reef, exposing them to enemy fire before they reached shore. When they did, they found themselves facing several hundred, perhaps over 1,000, warriors prepared for battle. The Spanish fired their muskets and crossbows, but the weapons were slow to reload and ineffective at long range in the open terrain. Their heavy armour slowed movement across the reef. Lapu-Lapu's warriors, lightly armed but fast and familiar with the terrain, closed the distance. Magellan attempted to lead from the front. He reportedly ordered his men to burn huts near the beach, hoping to draw the defenders into chaos. But the tactic failed. The warriors of Mactan were not intimidated, they were emboldened. As the fight dragged on, Magellan was struck by a spear in the leg. Moments later, a bamboo lance pierced his arm. Surrounded, bleeding, and unable to retreat, he continued to fight. According to eyewitness accounts, Magellan was eventually struck in the face, then brought to the ground. A group of warriors closed in. He was killed where he fell, on the beach of Mactan, far from the court of Spain and the riches of the Spice Islands. His body was never recovered. With Ferdinand Magellan dead, the expedition was left leaderless, fractured, and far from its original objective. The man who had dreamed of a western sea route to Asia would never complete the circle. Yet, the voyage he began did not end with him. In the days following Magellan's death at Mactan, chaos gripped the fleet. The alliance with Raja Humabon, once seen as a cornerstone of Spanish influence, began to crumble. Without Magellan's leadership and military presence, the Spaniards were no longer useful or welcome. A short time later, Humabon invited the Spanish leaders to a feast. It was a trap. During the meal, a number of Spaniards were ambushed and killed. The survivors fled Cebu, abandoning the idea of further conquest or conversion. The remaining fleet, now just 2 ships, the Victoria and the Trinidad, set sail once more. Command shifted several times as illness, conflict, and desertion took their toll. Eventually, under Juan Sebastian Elcano, the Victoria pressed on toward the Spice Islands. After trading for valuable cloves in the Moluccas, Elcano chose to return by sailing westward, continuing what Magellan had begun. In September 1522, the Victoria limped into Seville, completing the first recorded circumnavigation of the globe. Only 18 of the original 270 men completed the journey. Magellan was not among them. Yet it was his vision, his navigational instincts, and his willingness to venture into the unknown that had made it possible. Magellan did not find a practical trade route to the Spice Islands. His voyage was long, dangerous, and filled with setbacks, but its impact was undeniable. It proved the vastness of the Earth, revealed the true scale of the Pacific, and demonstrated, through action rather than theory, that the world could be circumnavigated by sea. The Spanish crown gained prestige, the Portuguese monopoly on eastern trade was challenged, and the age of exploration surged forward. For European powers, it was a confirmation of global possibilities, for colonization, commerce, and conquest. For Magellan himself, legacy came not from arrival, but from ambition. He never lived to see the voyage complete. But the journey he began reshaped the world. Was he a hero of exploration, a symbol of imperial ambition, a skilled navigator, or a flawed commander who overreached at the wrong moment? Historians continue to debate these questions. But what is clear is this: Ferdinand Magellan's voyage was one of the most audacious undertakings in maritime history. It was not only the first to encircle the globe, but also the first to confront, in scale and scope, the true dimensions of the planet we live on. Magellan's voyage didn't just cross oceans. It crossed the boundaries of what the world thought was possible. He left behind a legacy shaped by ambition, courage, and costly mistakes. Centuries later, we still wrestle with his story. Was he a visionary explorer, or a warning about the price of empire? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Which part of Magellan's journey made the biggest impact on you? And whose untold story should we dive into next? Thanks for joining us here on Tales of History. Until our next journey, stay curious.